And so one of the things to help prime our melatonin production at night and also to keep us in alignment with cortisol is to get bright morning light. I think that most people know that, but even small amounts of that morning light, even if you live in a cloudy area, melatonin, part of its function at night is to help the removal of things like beta amyloid from the brain, which is really important because if you want to have clear cognition during the day, you can't be detoxifying the brain while you're actually using it. You have to be in this dream state when the brain cells shrink up to 60% to allow for the convection of a lot of these amyloid proteins and other waste products out of the brain into the lymphatic fluid, then into the lymph for disposal.
Welcome and good morning. Welcome to the Dr. Espen podcast. I am Espen. Today I am joined by Dr. Deanna Minich. This is going to be a great conversation around the power of nutrition and the power of lifestyle. We're going to talk everything from health, vitality, all the way to peak performance and how to get the best output out of your energy. This is going to be a great conversation, so stay tuned. Lean in, take a big breath. And let's start with the introduction. Dr. Deanna Minich is a certified functional medicine practitioner. She's a nutritional scientist, international lecturer, educator, and author with over 20 years of experience in academia in the food and dietary supplement industry, currently serving as Chief Science Officer at the Symphony Natural Health. She's been active as a functional medicine clinician in clinical trials in her own practices, which is what she refers to as food and spirit. How powerful and congruent those two names go together. She's also the author of 6 consumer books on wellness topics, 4 book chapters, and over 50 scientific, let's hear that again, 50 scientific publications. So today we are going to go deep into the power of food, the importance of food, the color of food, and also looking deep into what it means to not only get well, to have more energy, but also potentially how to reverse aging as we go through life and have more vitality, more energy as we go along. This is a conversation you do not want to miss. So I want to say special welcome. Diana, how are you this morning?
Hi, good to be here with you. Sounds like we're going to cover a lot of topics. There's a lot going in this conversation, and I'm excited for it.
As am I. Firstly, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. We do know that if we don't take charge on our own health and our own well-being and our own nutrition, we're going to see some pretty challenging futures ahead for people in general. And we also know that it is oftentimes quite simple in theory, but it does not always act that way or work that way in practice. So I want to start with the first question. What do you find is now that we know the importance of nutrition and lifestyle and these incredibly fundamental principles of health and vitality, what do you find is the number one reason or cause of people neglecting their own body and not necessarily taking care of themselves in the way that they might want to?
I think it has to do with circadian dysregulation. I think that we're living out of alignment with nature. Most people know what they need to do. They just can't find the time or the bandwidth, or they can't actually parse out their day and night rhythm in such a way that they're optimized. And actually, this is a lot of information that's already out there and it's available to many people without cost. But yet it requires a lot to reconfigure one's life, right? So I think that so much hinges on circadian rhythm. And what's happening in our society is we are creating a darkness deficiency. We have so much artificial light at night. We have so much electric light, improper light at different times of the day. So I feel like this is one of those untapped areas that most people just they haven't quite got it yet, that there's a circadian rhythm to just about everything, from your salivary flow to your gut health. Even your muscles are primed based on your circadian clock. So everything hinges upon that, right? The time that you're eating, the time that you're resting, the time that you're fasting. So I do think that this in part is responsible to a large extent for things like metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes, as well as even metabolic syndrome, also looking at distortions in body composition or just kind of being off with metabolism. Espen, I like to drill things down to the cellular level. And so when I'm looking at circadian rhythm and a lot of the different dysfunctions that we have these days, I feel like so much goes into the mitochondria, so much in the way of not really harnessing our mitochondria appropriately, right? So even looking at different strategies to optimize adipose tissue through the mitochondria, or looking at how we can better become more metabolically flexible through the mitochondria through different phytochemicals. So I know that this is kind of a big expanse to your initial question, but I'd love to kind of dive into how people can better live in alignment with nature and also in alignment with their own clock rhythm.
I think what you're sharing there, Diana, is incredibly important because I think as humans, we've lost connection to nature in terms of the rhythm and the circadian rhythm that you speak to so specifically. Everything happens in cycles and seasons. Even the economy is in cycles and seasons. The sun goes up, the sun comes down. We've got the four seasons. And as such, then, if we don't live in circadian rhythm, of course, things are going to be out of balance. Makes a lot of sense. So how does one get into balance? Is it in regards to eating in alignment with the seasons? Is it in regards to blue light? You mentioned particularly, I've got these blue blockers, melatonin playing a role. Give us your 2 cents worths on maybe the easiest steps for someone to get back into circadian rhythm and rhythm with nature.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of different rhythms. So let's first talk about circadian rhythm, then we'll talk about lunar rhythm, and then we'll talk about seasonal rhythm. And maybe as part of seasonal rhythm, we can talk about the season of one's birth, because I don't think many people realize how the month that you're born can also determine your trajectory forward to some extent for your adult life. So circadian rhythm, this is the 24-hour day and night cycle. And according to certain research studies, and I think of Dr. Sachin Panda, who is at Salk Institute, and I had the opportunity just recently to be in person with him and to talk with him about his research. And if you look at his book, The Circadian Code, I feel like this is a great tool for many people because he does go into all the different times of the day and when things are happening. So just to think about how people can get into their circadian alignment. And it's not just having this connection to a clock, but it's being connected consistently to that clock. Because, I think many times we get off track. We think that just because it's the weekend, we can go off of our daily schedule. So then we have social jet lag, right? So we're kind of in this somewhat quasi state of always being a shift worker or being out of alignment. So just to kind of run through the day quickly, just to give people some ideas here. When we look at the morning times, and again, there are times for all of these things. Many times I try to look at when does the hormone come up. Cortisol and testosterone are active right upon waking. In fact, many times that is what's getting us out of bed. And so one of the things to help prime our melatonin production at night and also to keep us in alignment with cortisol is to get bright morning light. I think that most people know that, but even small amounts of that morning light, even if you live in a cloudy area, and if you don't have access to bright morning light, there are certain types of, whether it's happy lights or certain types of bulbs or luminosity in order to expose the eye to that full spectrum light, right? That's really important to kind of like set our day kind of in this direction of being optimum. And then when we think of the morning time, not only is cortisol up, testosterone is up, but our digestive capacity is up. So within 1 hour after waking, this is typically the time to start to eat. So when we're getting up within that first hour, just kind of letting the body circulate, let the digestive system go, because I think what happens in the morning is that many people just get up and go, they quickly drink a shake, and then they're out the door. But we actually need to have that kind of slower morning to get our digestive tract and everything else working so that we can have a bowel movement, our blood pressure is going up. We're starting to create more mental performance and capacity through those morning hours. So how we open up our day is how the rest of the day will end up going, most likely. So then we kind of move into the early afternoon hours. I think that if you look at the research on time restricted eating, that having an 8 to 10 hour window of eating is optimal. Anything too much beyond that window of time kind of leads into less metabolic flexibility or having more circadian disruption. And I think even that is a pearl that most people don't realize. So if you have your breakfast, let's just say at 7 a.m., then your last bite of food would be at 5 p.m. And that doesn't have to be the case. Like, you can actually shift that a bit, and you could say, well, I'm not going to eat breakfast until 10 a.m. So then your last meal, if you're doing a 10-hour time restricted eating, would be then at 8 p.m. That would be the last time that you can have food coming in. So I think that's another principle to be thinking about. When it comes to the circadian rhythm, our muscles are also run on clock genes. And so even our strength, our metabolic fitness is determined by the circadian rhythm. So what we see with metabolic efficiency is typically in the afternoon, like between 2 and 4 p.m. is when people tend to have better coordination, better flexibility. And it makes sense too, because we've been moving the body for most of the day. So now we're ready to ramp up from a physical perspective. And then finally, kind of taking us into the nighttime, I would say that we need to follow not just the light of the morning, but also the darkness. So that's called dim light melatonin onset. So as it becomes dimmer outside, we should parallel our inner home environment, or wherever we are, we could be at work, to match what's outside. So just like you mentioned with blue light blocking glasses, if it is starting to become winter, I know you're moving into the summer months, the spring months, but I'm in just the reverse, right? So I'm in fall, I'm heading towards winter. The nights are becoming longer. So we need to really honor darkness and give our pineal gland enough time to produce proper amounts of melatonin. And we know that even seasonally, like when we have more darkness because of the autumn or the winter, there can be onset symptoms or even relapses of things like autoimmune conditions. And it's thought to be due to the changes in melatonin and vitamin D, which sync up with light and dark. I actually call them circadian nutrients because, many people think of melatonin as just a very simple hormone released from the pineal gland, helps us with sleep. And I would say that that is like the least of its function. Its function is actually to track our entire clock system throughout our body to nature. It's a circadian signal. So as we get older and as we make our way into our 40s, I would even say mid 30s, 40s and on, like as we get older, we start to lose the production of the pineal gland melatonin. So we stop sleeping so well. And this is also connected into circadian disruption. So I'll just stop there for a second because that's a lot. But if everybody were just to think about their day and their night rhythm and being consistent so that the body knows when there's going to be food, is it 8 a.m., 1 p.m., 5 p.m., and as much as we can to actually create a ritual through the day and then to be thinking about our nighttime, because we need the night to actually detoxify the brain. Melatonin, part of its function at night is to help the removal of things like beta amyloid from the brain, which is really important because if you want to have clear cognition during the day, you can't be detoxifying the brain while you're actually using it. You have to be in this dream state when the brain cells shrink up to 60% to allow for the convection of a lot of these amyloid proteins and other waste products out of the brain into the lymphatic fluid, then into the lymph for disposal. And ironically, perhaps, we're starting to now learn that melatonin is part of that process.
Which makes absolutely a lot of sense considering what you mentioned with the pineal gland secreting and creating melatonin to get us into the circadian rhythm and the sleep-wake cycle. I mean, a lot of the ancient indigenous ones used to say, arise and retire with the sun. And I think it's interesting because when I had a franchise of health clinics, medical clinics with, functional medicine doctors, we had naturopaths, chiropractors, dentists, and MDs, etc. And I did a case study with 1,000 patients where we basically did basic bloods and looked at the deficiencies. And we found that 96 out of 100 were deficient in the four following things: vitamin D. Okay. And this is incredible. I mean, vitamin D as a deficiency, how much of a precursor isn't that to chronic disease in general? Just by not having light on the body. If that burning ball in the sky suddenly stops burning, life is over as we know it. So I think we've been, I don't know, duped, but certainly neglected the fact that as humans, we need to get sunlight on the body. It is so important. And of course, I live in Australia and I'm white skinned, so I don't want to burn. But I was doing breath work in the sun before our interview because that is how I nourish my body. So I wanted to just quickly speak to that. And so we see vitamin D deficiency, magnesium, essential fatty acids, and then, of course, it depends on the individual. But across the board, what I found is that most MDs in general, or doctors in general, don't really do these tests unless we specifically see signs of pathology. So we need to go to a functional medical doctor like yourself, or a naturopath, or someone of that nature, and ask quality questions. Because, I mean, what is the symptom of a deficiency in vitamin D? I mean, it could be anything. You really don't know. As I say, how do you know if you're healthy? And people, an answer, well, I feel great. And so then the next question is, does the absence of symptoms mean that you are healthy? And of course, the answer is no. Cardiovascular disease and cancer, we can have both and still feel fine. So I just wanted to ask, firstly, thank you on talking about the circadian rhythm. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper in this because, and this may be a little bit esoteric, but I'd love your opinion on this. As I've studied this, you mentioned the lunar cycle, the cycle of the moon. We know that the moon has such an effect upon the planet that it raises and drops the level of the ocean. So of course it has a profound effect on our human biology as well, including emotions perhaps. And so as I've studied this, I found, you mentioned the lunar cycle. So let's go a little bit deeper. I found an ancient study in the Upanishads that showed that us men also have cycles similar to you, very different, of course, but in rhythm and, circadian rhythms, etc. And I realized that once per month, the moon is in my star sign. And when the moon is in my star sign, I will say retain my seed, do breath work, and do an extended water fast for 3 days, not every month, but most months, to be able to regenerate what's referred to as the sacred secret or the metaphysical seed. And I might be stretching it here, but I just wanted your 2 cents worth on this because you've done a lot of research. When we talk about peak vitality, optimal performance, and maybe even cellular regeneration, what have you found in regards to living in alignment with cycles at that level, please?
Wow. I don't think I've met so many people who are doing what you just described. Usually we hear about it in relationship to the menstrual cycle. Right. So, but what you're saying is absolutely correct. Like we could go so much deeper into the lunar cycle, which would oversee the water element of our bodies. Right. So anything that connects to water or the flux and the flow of water, that could be toxin elimination or stagnation. There's even a very interesting study looking at full moons and how they change melatonin levels. This was done in a sleep lab. And what the researchers found was that 4 days before and 4 days after a full moon, there was a noticeable significant decrease in endogenous melatonin production. And also deep sleep decreased. The time to fall asleep had also increased. Sleep was just disrupted. And that was done without the interference of actually seeing the light outside. So, yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense. And I'm really glad that you're into looking at what I would call astrobiology, or looking at the influence of planets or these big luminous bodies on our physiology, because I think that there's a lot more there, whether we look at solar flares, we're looking at full moons or different cycles of the moon, or even again, if we go into our season of birth, which if we look at that specifically, because there's been some research about it, and it's not to say that our birth date will predetermine the rest of our lives, but there is a connection between our birth month and what diseases we might be primed for. There was a very large study in which thousands of different diseases were looked at, and this was just through hospital records, where they looked at people that had birth dates and what did they actually die of. And what they found was that 55 diseases out of all of these different diseases were actually dependent on their birth month. Now,
So majority.
well, actually, I mean, we could look at it both ways. I mean, if they looked at many different diseases, so, but, if you happen to have one of those 55, I mean, there could be a stronger risk for you for that particular disease. So you might ask, well, why is that? You might take different entry points into that way of thinking. But if we just look from a medical perspective, if you look at the in utero development based on when you are conceived, if you look at the development of a fetus and all the different systems, and when you may or may not have access to certain nutrients because of the seasonal connection. For example, I believe, if I recall this correctly, people born in November had the most amount of issues with certain diseases, and they actually segmented these in cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, and some of them tracked very similarly, but the November births had more challenge. And if you just back that up 9 months to February, you wouldn't have a lot of light then, right? You're coming on the heels of a winter, potentially, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. And this study was done in the Northern Hemisphere in New York. So I just think it's kind of interesting, right? And then people aren't eating in season. So if you really want to prime yourself, in terms of being connected to nature's rhythms, you have to eat what nature provides. And what we're now finding out, and this is so exciting to me, is how much of the different phytochemicals are now being looked at as chronobiotics, meaning that there are certain things in plant foods that will signal to our hypothalamus a hormonal change. Maybe that's in leptin or some other hormone. And by the way, this is mostly done in animal studies, so it's very difficult, of course, to kind of look at this in humans for the most part. But in animals, when they feed a food that would be out of season, and there's a way to do this through a research construct, what they find is a metabolic dysregulation. And they find that many times that fat metabolism is not optimized. It's actually, there's actually dysmetabolism. So it's kind of interesting that we see these effects of what happens when you're not eating according to season. So I think all of these rhythms are a big deal, whether it's the lunar, the birth month, the circadian rhythm. The one that we have probably most visibility into, and it's just right there in front of us, is truly the circadian rhythm, though, because every hour of every day, we're thinking about that. And we're not thinking so much about the lunar cycle for the most part. But I think all of them, if there was a way to configure that from a testing perspective, because even when we test, and I think that this is often overlooked, is when we test, like what time of the year, what time of the month, particularly for women. And also, if we can extend that into, what about taking therapeutics? Because I've even seen a study where if you take resveratrol in the morning versus the night, you can have an antioxidant effect versus a pro-oxidant effect. And if you look at just what we talk about with supplements and taking therapeutic nutrients, we still do not have the sophistication of looking at the timing sequence, right? Looking at when we can best take something for the desired benefit. We may actually have an untoward effect of something if it's taken at the wrong time, but we may not actually have that knowing.
Nor do I think we have the gut biome and or absorption to actually absorb the things that we're purchasing, in the first place. So, I mean, this conversation goes many layers deep.
Yeah.
I find this so interesting that, a woman with your level of experience, a person with your level of experience with 50 publications in this field, our conversations is around cycles and seasons and the movement of the planets. And again, studying the ancient ones, why did they build the pyramid in a millimeter correction to the movement of the planet and the position of the planets? This is something to really look at. And I think humanity might have forgotten
Yeah.
that, the answers are, if we look up, we can see the patterns and the seasons and we understand the power of the sun. So thank you for reminding us. And I just want to also remind listeners and viewers, what we do differently here on the podcast is to deliver you very powerful, simple to apply strategies. The strategies that Dr. Deanna has now shared, it doesn't cost you anything to start to look at your circadian rhythm, make sure you have some red light or stop the blue light into your retina late at night, turn your phone off, sit in meditation, and apply some of these things. You could simply go back and listen to this interview again and take notes and how you're going to apply it accordingly. So I could talk for days about this. I'm so excited about this topic. I just want to kind of segue quickly because we're seeing now across the world, I wouldn't necessarily say depopulation, but what I'd say is a significant drop in birth rates. We're seeing the opportunity for the human race to reproduce itself getting more and more threatened by, the environment and the microplastics or the nanoplastics and the hormonal disruptions in the amount of chemicals and phthalates and things that are found in foods. I read a study the other day that said that 50% of the American population in total is diabetic or pre-diabetic, and up to 25 to 30%, depending on the study, of young males have a problem with erection or premature ejaculation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just seems that humanity is on the path to not necessarily self-destruction, but certainly an inability to reproduce. And we know, particularly in countries like Australia, we are so underpopulated that we are having, challenges now. What's going to happen in the future? So I just wanted to get you 2 cents worth on that. When I discovered the principles of health, I realized that I was overfed and undernourished.
Yeah.
I realized that so much of what I put in my body was to emotionally equilibrate myself, or I tried to, but it was full of toxins and not serving me. And by the path of elimination and by the path of purification, I have lived with intermittent fasting for many years. I go on long extended water fasts, and I deliberately and regularly try to purify myself and protect myself from the poisons that are now found everywhere in our environment. I'd love your opinion on the matter, and also quickly just some steps that we could take right now to start to purify ourselves and ensure that we can move forward with a healthy lineage and a healthy human species. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. The toxin load, as we refer to it, right? It's the accumulation of different, could be physical toxins, but what I have actually done is gone beyond the physical. I mean, the physical toxins are truly an issue. And in fact, arsenic is probably the number one on the list of all the different CDC, Centers for Disease Control, toxins, right? We think of arsenic being connected to diabetes, being connected to cancers. So I definitely acknowledge that, and I teach that, and that has been the focus of my work for so long. I also think, though, that we have toxins threaded through every aspect of our being. So just to kind of go through those and give some ideas here for everybody listening.
This is the food and spirit part that's happening right now. So I'd like
yes.
to pay close attention. Just before we move on, listen to this. 99% of our body and being is non-physical. We only know a tiny percent of the body is made of the physical matter. So what we're about to talk about is energy and the spiritual aspect. This is really what I believe is cause rather than effect. So back to you, please.
Wow, it's so refreshing to have an open, expansive conversation about these things. So it's really bridging science and spirituality, right? And merging them together. So when I think of whole detox, that's the name of one of my books. And I think about the 7 aspects of our being, which are actually very spiritual and energetic, if you're actually wanting to go there. So when I think about even the root chakra part of us, it's the aspect of our physical being. And obviously there are things like toxic metals. That really brings me into the earth element. It brings me into the soil because our soils are becoming very toxic and actually very mineral depleted. And we need the minerals to compete with the toxic metals. We're actually protected from a lot of the toxic metals, or even just things like arsenic. I'm also thinking mercury, cadmium, lead. These types of things can be offset by things in soil, like minerals. I feel like minerals give us a supercharge in terms of what
Yeah.
they're giving to our, not just our physical body, but works very well with water and in terms of creating flow and creating energy and resonance. So really looking at minerals, I think, is a very important piece of that. When I think of the sacral chakra, I think of emotions, I think of relationships, I think of partnerships, the energy of two. And many times we have a lot of dysfunction and toxicity here, where we have certain aspects about being codependent or having dysfunctional relationships. Many times the people that we're connected to, we're taking on that in the way of energy. And also that can relate to toxic behaviors, right? So toxic behaviors in the way of partnerships, but also emotions. When I was in the clinic and doing work with people in the way of nutritional detoxification, I often saw that a lot of emotional release happened. And so I do think that there is a lot of stagnation and stuckness as it relates to emotions. And so having that emotional baggage, how do we release that? Right. And so as we do a lot of the physical processing, what can happen is we start to release the emotions, which is good. We just need a container or some way to process them in such a way that they don't create more toxicity for us. Then when I think of the solar plexus chakra, which is our fire center, this is, I have a questionnaire and I've surveyed so many people, like thousands of people. The one energy center that seems to be off for 80% of people is the solar plexus. So
Yeah.
this is how we burn. This is how we give energy and how we take energy. It's our work-life balance. It's the center of transformation. And so what's the toxicity here? Perfectionism, overwork, just not allowing ourselves to have joy. So it's really being, I would say we could also have toxic thoughts, which if you look at traditional Chinese medicine, so I'm married to an acupuncturist and we have lots of these east-west conversations. And so in Chinese medicine, the spleen-stomach interface is more of that seat of thought and rumination. So a lot of mental energy is connected into digestive energy. And for some of us, we have a lot of that, the rumination, the pessimism, kind of like just the recycling and using a lot of our chi, our ki, in order to think rather than to digest. So that could be a form of toxicity. In the heart chakra, when I think of some kind of toxicity or what could move that system better, I think of some kind of physical activity, some kind of movement, right? As my dad always said, when you stop moving, you start dying. So I kind of feel like, encouraging flow in all the different body systems, the throat chakra. I think of with toxic words, toxic things that we stuff down or things that we say just outright without any kind of compassionate sieve from the heart, right? So we can have a lot of toxicity build up into the neck, and that might manifest as bruxism, like we grind our teeth at night. We've got a tight, clenched jaw. We've got throat issues, constant sore throats. We've got, so many things that we have emotions around lodged somewhere in the body. And for me, that's kind of like the roadmap of like how to find it and how to move it through. Then I also think about the pituitary, the third eye, and not having proper sleep. And sleep is on its own detoxifying. So as I was mentioning about melatonin, but then also meditation. In fact, meditation is incredibly powerful for the mitochondria and for healing the body. Right. I think that many of us don't give ourselves the reset, the pause, the silence, the stillness in order to regenerate. So, Espen, when you talk about aging and trying to reduce the signs of aging or even reverse, I mean, I feel like we've got to go into the yin. So many of us are afraid of
Yeah.
dark, right? So, how do we actually preserve that and come into that space of being silent? And then the crown chakra, the last one, I just think about fasting. You talked about your experience with fasting, but I'm thinking of not just fasting from food, but fasting from so many things, like even visuals or social media, or fasting from certain situations, or taking a work sabbatical. We can look
Yeah.
at fasting in kind of metaphorical directions. So that's kind of how I see toxicity. I don't see it cut and dry, like just go get a lab test and figure out your physical toxins. I see it as threaded through the whole of our being.
I don't really know what to say right now because I love synchronicities so much. And I wanted to just take this moment to tell you a very quick story because what you've just
Yeah.
shared is almost hand in glove with a methodology that I discovered. So I was in clinic and I was very successful and I got burnt out, adrenal fatigue,
Mm.
whatever. 2016, I sold out of the clinics and I decided to take time. I disappeared into the jungle in Peru. I sat on the ground. I fasted for 20 days. I started drinking ayahuasca. I started praying. I started fasting. I started listening. I started practicing stillness. And as such, I started to discover this interesting, again, blueprint from the ancient Bhagavad Gita teachings in the Upanishads
Yeah.
that showed that there was a direct connection between the energy centers or the chakras and our physical existence. It's as if to say, you don't have to go without when you go within. So I discovered that the first energy center, the root center that you mentioned, was blocked by fear. And it indeed was directly connected to our physical health. And so then I saw the pattern between, well, what is fear? Fear is stress, cortisol, fight or flight, related to every single chronic disease as far as we know.
Yep.
Okay, so that makes sense. The second energy center, as you mentioned so beautifully, more of a feminine energy center, is blocked by guilt. The
Mhm.
third one blocked by shame. The fourth one blocked by grief. The fifth one blocked by lies and how we're not living lives in alignment with our highest values and our true spiritual expression. The sixth one blocked by the illusion of separation. And the seventh one blocked by earthly attachments and addictions. It's basically another way of explaining what you just
Yeah.
shared.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is ancient truth, actually. We're just repurposing it in the modern age,
Yeah,
right? And in fact, even when I started doing nutrition, I have I don't know, you probably have seen this, but food and spirit. Why do I call it that?
yeah,
Because I started
love
to
it.
see that there was a connection between the endocrine system and the chakras, right? What is a chakra? It is the psychoneuroendocrine immune system. Now we just
Oof.
see it within modern day. But, as I see it, there's a color code to food as well. Like each of those colors, there's a nature signature that's connected to the vibration of color. Those wavelengths are conferring some kind of connection to the ancient mitochondria as they become broken down and give off this light, right? Which has different sprays of nanometers and wavelengths. So anyway, I mean, back when I wrote my first book called Chakra Foods, back in, I don't know, I think it was 2008, I had a dear mentor say to me that, maybe this was like too much stepping out there of creating this like crosstalk amongst ancient work and
Mm,
modern day. But I think, and that's why I've since recoined it as the rainbow diet, because I don't actually need to say the word chakra. And I don't even know if it's a chakra that I'm really referring to. It is like these centers within us that have endocrine activity that are communicating something that is felt on the energetic, emotional, mental, in much deeper realms, right? And if we really tune into those individual centers, you know, they're portals, right? But we can have them in the everyday through our circadian rhythm, through the plate of food with all the different colors, right? So when we nourish the rainbow within through the rainbow on the outside, whether it's light or it's food with phytochemicals, I mean, you name it, everything is informing us, right? So it's really lovely to have this conversation with you, being of like minds with taking the ancient concepts, because to me, anything that survives that long just feels true.
yeah. And thank God that we now have physicians and professionals that are looking outside of the standard paradigm, because if we continue with the standard paradigm, then we may go extinct. We're deep into the sixth mass extinction right now. But I have a really great hope for humanity that we are going to turn this around. It was the end of the Mayan calendar. We started receiving a lot more light. You mentioned, for example, some of the light that is coming in now. We can measure this with the Schumann resonance. We're seeing a huge change. I believe an activation of the dormant superpower and potential of the human DNA and the purification process. I mean, we don't have to go any further than the Bible and the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and all these ancient teachings to teach us about the power of fasting and about our connection to source. And I think what you share now in regards to the energy centers and colors is something so simple that anyone can apply at any moment. Is it as such that if you eat a red food, that'll then assist and be relevant for the first energy center, an orange food, and orange, for example, assisting the second energy center? Is it as such? What would you say is the easiest way for a person, apart from eating lean, green, clean, and organic, and having that 8-hour eating, 16-hour fasting window? Apart from that, is it as simple as that? Or what would you say to those who might be new to these topics?
Yeah, so let me break it down a little bit because I call it a color code. So most people don't think in chakras, and also it's really hard to verify that there's an energy response from a food in a particular area. So what I have done is I've taken each of those 7 areas of the body and connected them to body systems. So let me just give you an example. So red colored foods that tend to be high in polyphenols and vitamin C. So things like red apples or red bell pepper or hibiscus. These things are informing our inflammatory immune system. So red to me is either pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, but it is connected through the immune inflammatory system, which would tie into adrenals. Orange foods, there are studies looking at taking in orange foods high in different carotenoids, benefiting things like progesterone or sperm health. You were talking about infertility, or looking at women with endometriosis and helping with reproductive health. So there's a connection there. Like, I actually published an article on this in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism, where I actually went through the 7 systems of the body and how the phytochemicals align. So orange is reproductive health. Yellow is digestive health. And I talk about prebiotic fibers, squashes, and I talk about acid catalysts. I talk about lemons, bioflavonoids, the yellow of bile, the yellow of stomach acid. The liver is like the ultimate vehicle of that heat and transformation of fire, right? So then we move up into the
Also, what are your thoughts on this? For me, I've noticed my gut biome has taken a lot of work, but that was because in a very high level of cortisol. So the cortisol and the stress and the fight or flight has a direct effect upon digestion and absorption, elimination, etc. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are like, even though I'm explaining them like Christmas tree lights, they're very interconnected. And so the way that I think about them, and this is how I've experienced them in people, is that if there's something going on in the solar plexus or in the gut, we need to look down to the root. And we need to look at fear response, cortisol. It's kind of the triangle of insulin, glucose, and cortisol, right? So like that cortisol continuing to tug, making us less efficient. And also, if we look at even gynecological issues, there is a gut gynecological axis. So women that have PCOS or infertility or PMS, they many times tend to have gut issues. So there's like a sharing of the space of many of these energy centers. And one of the things that I have taught in the certification, the Food and Spirit certification, is that if you want to work on a certain center, like let's just say somebody wants to work on their heart, they're having a lot of issues with grief, or either it could be overactive or underactive, right? So either we've closed it down or it's too much. We're over giving and over, compassion fatigue. So what we can do there is we can focus on the energy centers at the above it and also below it. And many times you see that there's an impact. And with people, and I started just to do this via pattern recognition. Like I was seeing people with closed down hearts not eating green leafy vegetables. It was like the weirdest thing. Like there was almost like an aversion to eating certain green foods. And so bringing in green, because green foods, leafy greens, tend to have the nitrates that we need in order to open up the blood vessels, right? So we're creating expansion and allowing the heart to be open versus contracted in. Same thing with like even the throat chakra. Like, what would you do there with things that are closed down? I would focus on how we eat. Chewing stimulates cognition. Bringing in broths, soups, sauces, smoothies, things that are alchemically more synchronized in their elements. So looking at water and matter coming together through this interface, right? And having more mindfulness can be very important for this area. And sometimes it's overactive and sometimes, again, it's underactive. And there's a way to assess that. So I think, and again, if we're working on any area of our body, and most people think, oh, like, let's just go with the gut. And I don't know if that's really always the best approach. I think you can start anywhere. You can start, I mean, even in Chinese medicine, there are the gut folks, like the spleen stomach people. There are the kidney chi people. There are the heart people. To me, it doesn't matter. The body is interconnected. So if you feel more of a resonance with your muscles and your structure, do that, because that's where your energy is. And working on muscle and structure will inform everything else. Gut health will change because your posture is changing, right? Like our gut microbiome changes with exercise. So to me, all paths lead in. And even though, again, I'm presenting this as a very linear circuitry, in my view, it doesn't really work like that.
It's interesting because when you study allopathic medicine, I think it's fair to say that it's been very segmented. Okay, let's specialize in the liver versus the head or the brain versus the heart.
Yeah.
Everything is a homeostatic system. If one thing is off, everything is affected. I love this. And I just want to acknowledge again, I have been in this field for quite a while. I have employed many MDs and naturopaths, and it's rare to have a conversation at this level. I did catch that you mentioned something about your food and spirit certification. And as I'm sitting here listening, my crown is tingling, my truth bumps are kicking in. And I want you to go a little bit deeper on this, because the question that I felt an urge to ask was, have you created a certification around this, and how can we assist in helping this become a part of your legacy? Because I can tell you right now, a lot of our listeners and viewers will be sitting at the edge of their chair going, I want to firstly do this for myself, and then I'm also potentially interested in learning how to do this for others. Please tell us about what you've done in terms of certification and how someone might get access to this work to learn, to grow, and to heal even more.
I started that certification in 2014, and I trained hundreds of different types of practitioners. In fact, I fostered this kind of environment, this milieu of diverse practitioners, because I love the crosstalk. In fact, I love going to meetings where you've got engineers, computer folks like that think in more IT language, or, and then bringing in medicine, bringing in the arts. So I haven't run a certification in some years, but I'm coming out with certain things that will inform it and change it a little bit. I've been busy writing and continuing to do more on plants and phytochemicals, because I do feel like that's where, again, a lot of this knowledge base is, this nature's intelligence is connected into the plants. But yes, I have done that. It's kind of like you with 2016, you were like burnt out and like you sold your clinic. I did a lot of it with the certification, and then I felt like, okay, now I need to transition and I need to get this other information out. You probably are aware of this, but I came out not too long ago with an article. I think you might like this kind of thinking. And it was because I'm very connected to plants. I do feel like plants, 80% of the biomass on this planet is plant, right?
Yep.
And plants, if you look at the book, Smarty Plants, it's an incredibly, there's one, Light Eaters, which is really great. Then there's also another book called Brilliant Green, talking about the many different senses of plants. So one of the things that I published on recently, just this year, was a new term. And I called it the Phytoneuroendocrine system. Like, how do we actually make nature part of what is informing us, the neuroendocrine system, right? So the
Of course
phytoneuro.
it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just to me, I feel like I keep wanting to bring plants into the conversation because they
Mm.
help us to adapt. And I feel like if we can tap into their intelligence, whether through observation, through intake, there's just so many different vehicles there for us to, I don't know, just become much more aligned. And it doesn't even have to involve our nutrition. It's just being around plants, right? I mean, there was even a study showing that having bushes and flowers and foliage close to the house changed the gut microbiome of people that were living in the home. So it's like even being around plants changes our gut microbiome, right? So I have a lot of passion around that, which is why I am doing more work with things like I mentioned to you, the melatonin. So we published an article looking also specifically at plant melatonin. So again, melatonin is ubiquitous. It's found in plants as a growth factor. I mean, plants don't have a pineal gland, but they have melatonin. The other
Hmm.
thing that I have, oh, since you were in Peru, and I was also in Peru at the end of last year for more of a spiritual trip, the other thing that I got really into was maca. So
I
maca,
love maca.
well, and we published a paper in February of this year talking about the colors of maca. Most people don't know that there are 17 different phenotypes of maca, which have
Mhm.
different DNA, different physiological effects, just a different phytochemical profile. So when I went to Peru, I mean, you basically see like the black maca, the red maca, the yellow maca, but then there are different, I would say, shades of each of these different types of maca. I mean, there's purple maca, there is pinkish kind of maca, and these types of maca express depending on the stresses in the environment, and then they can impart different physiological effects to us. Like most people think of maca as, oh, it's just an adaptogen, it's just for the adrenals. Well, not so. In fact, it could actually inform certain aspects of our pituitary. It can change ovarian function. Certain ones can be helpful for prostate health and even for men's
Hormones.
reproductive
Yeah.
function. So it's like, I don't know, I'm just really, I think the whole course, the one thing that has stayed the same for me throughout the entire lineage of what I've done professionally has always been plants in some
Mm.
way, shape, or form. I just feel like our healing in so many ways is connected to them.
Mm. Maca's really interesting. I did a clinical trial on myself where I superdosed with maca for an extensive period of time, and my testosterone levels went through the roof.
So what
So
is
it's
a
really,
superdose? What do you consider that?
I would have a, say, 3 to 4 grams of maca twice a day.
Okay, yeah. That's pretty high.
Yeah. And I just wanted to see what, and like endocrine effect it had.
Yeah,
And my testosterone levels started climbing and climbing and climbing.
amazing.
And also, yeah, it was really, really interesting. So maca, for those of you who don't know, is considered a superfood, detoxifier, adaptogen coming out of South America, if I'm correct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where it's natively grown. But what has happened is because of its popularity, people have brought it to China or Tibet and tried to grow it, and you don't actually get the same physiological effects because you don't have the same
Mm.
stresses in the environment. And in Peru, how they grow food and how they grow plants is very unique. It's almost in concentric circles. I took so many pictures of this and like how they created that within the mountainous area. Whereas if you look at China or Tibet, many times it's in rows. It's very
Yeah.
linear. It's not very feminine and kind of in this really beautiful circle-like structure. So,
And where in nature do you find anything linear?
right,
Right.
right.
No straight lines in nature.
Yes.
Oh, I love this conversation. I could talk to you all day. Just checking in. How long do we have you for?
Yeah. How about until the quarter past, like 5:15 my time? So what would that be your time? Like 9:15? No,
Uh,
10:50. 10:50.
another 10 minutes?
Yeah. Yeah, that works.
Okay. Okay, so again, just quickly tell us, where do people go to learn more about your work? I would love if you would share access to the publications that you've done. We'll put those in the show
Yeah.
notes,
Yeah.
and tell us where else can people go to learn more. Definitely get access to your books, online programs, teachings, maybe videos like this online.
Yeah. I would say going to my website, so deannaminich.com, and on there I have a resources tab, and I've created a lot of free educational information for people. I also have a blog. People seem to like my blogs. You know, they're more techie, more sciencey. And then my Instagram is probably where you're going to find my more arty side, my more spiritual side. My Facebook page, Deanna Minich, PhD. That's also, I try to keep up on that with science. And I make all of my own posts because I really do feel like I want my energy. And, it's never like I'm just like planning and mapping out posts on Facebook or Instagram. It's like, what is the feeling? Like I really connect into it. So when you look at those posts, you're going to see just different slices of the information that I'm into, which do span science and spirituality. And I would even say art, right? Because a lot of my images, people seem to like them because they're very colorful and, it's just a way to tap into the information from a visual perspective.
And art, indeed, it is to bridge the gap between science and spirituality, between the science and the ancient arts of living in alignment and homeostasis with nature. I think this is the only way to advance both educational curriculums and as well as medicine moving forward. So I'm just acknowledging you for dancing in both worlds and doing so coherently. I think it's rare. I know it's rare, but it's a breath of fresh air.
Wow. You're like my kind of person. We would be hanging out if you lived over here in the Pacific Northwest. I want to say one thing about art as we come to a close here, because one of the aspects of my healing was, so just a little bit of backstory, a personal story on my own journey, right? So I grew up in a very strict household. And so my dad was a police officer. My mom was very religious. And there was a lot of restriction around eating. So my mom was a health nut when it wasn't really cool to be a health nut. So I grew up in the 1970s. I'm 53 now. And as I went through my teen years, I developed an eating disorder. I had all kinds of issues with my reproductive system. So that's why when I mentioned gynecological and gut access, just kind of seeing those two coming together, because I saw that within myself. But I also saw that I had an emotional connection to restriction, fear, growing up Catholic, and, the sense of like really squashing sexuality, sensuality, right? So fast forward into my 20s, I get into yoga. I start taking a world's religions course. I was pre-med. So even from the get-go, I was really turned on to science and spirituality. But it wasn't until my late 20s when I was finishing up my PhD that I was super stressed out. And I decided to go to the art store and just buy a bunch of paints over a weekend because I was in the lab so much. I was just like, I just need to get this out. So I started making these bright shapes on large pieces of paper and just putting them all over my living space at the time, just like bright colors. I never took like a drawing or painting class. I don't know. I just felt like I had to get it out. It was cathartic. So then fast forward into my 30s, and I'm still I'm finding that whenever I'm stressed out, I'm painting. I end up meeting my future partner. His name is Mark. And I noticed that so Mark is really into music. He's an acupuncturist and his art is music. So I noticed whenever he would play music, I would start painting. And I started making all of these paintings and putting them all over the house. And soon Mark was saying, Deanna, you're putting your ovaries and your uterus all over the house. What is going on? And I had all of these issues still, right? And I didn't see it. I didn't see that there were these unifying shapes. I kept painting with the colors orange and pink and gold, and I just kept painting them over and over. And once Mark said that to me, I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. My body is talking to me. So then I started to intentionally paint, and I did all of the phases of the uterus. I did conception, menstruation, I did menopause. I did this whole aspect of my uterus, right? So I went in because I was getting checked every year for my gynecological exam because I had a blocked fallopian tube. I had some issues with my uterus, all these kinds of things. And then after I did all of this artwork, and then I had an art gallery showing, just a very informal one where I invited friends. We had a friend in the neighborhood who had an art gallery, and I said, well, maybe I could just show some of my paintings. Well, there was something about people witnessing my art and giving me feedback like, oh, wow, this is what I'm seeing. And, this is making me feel a certain way. Long story short, my issues that I had, the blocked fallopian tube was totally open and clear. My gynecologist said, your uterus is beautiful, like things had cleared up. And I don't want to make it sound like art and just making some paintings healed me completely. I know it was like everything combined, but there was something about the emotional, mental release that I found through art and through getting messy on a canvas that I couldn't find in my everyday life. I was a scientist by that point. So I want to leave everybody with the message of what you're cultivating here in this space of your podcast, which is expansion. And I feel like one of the ways that we really tap into our life force is through creative expression of some type. And for you, it might be music or words or poetry or music or like listening to music or walking in nature, whatever it is. But for me, it was very visual and it was color. Color became my nutrient, and everything that I was painting was like the nutrient I needed for my sacral chakra. So I want to, that's not a story I tell so many times in every podcast, but I think it's a really important one. And I never want that one to be lost because color is an important connector to our psyche and can be an emotional vehicle for us as well. And so I had a positive experience. I don't feel the need to paint like I did then. Now I do just different things. It's more about being in nature and being on the inside. I don't need to like bring it out anymore. But I think for my process and what I went through, it was absolutely necessary. And it led to food and spirit, actually.
So I wonder then within, listeners and viewers, what it is that's suppressed, repressed, that could be expressed through that creativity using color or paint or sound or music or dance or whatever your creative flow is something to consider perhaps, because I think if we suppress our emotions and even our gifts, I think it'll what we suppress will be expressed kind of thing. So thank you for sharing that story. And I think what you just shared gives us all permission to express ourselves in that way even more. I want to ask you two last questions. Firstly, I love this conversation. Can we have you back on the podcast for a sequel?
Sure, absolutely.
Let's do it. And then the last question I've got for you, please, is I want you now to imagine that you are on the so-called world stage. Every sentient being alive has gathered, watching, tuning in, and listening to your message to the world right now. When you're ready, take a breath. And whenever you're ready, please do share. What is your message to the world right now?
I have 4 messages, concisely. Color, creativity, diversity, and rhythm. I think if people can just remember those 4 things in whatever ways that they speak to you, I feel like those are healing vehicles. So color, creativity, diversity, and rhythm.
Beautiful. That's DeannaMinich.com. So DeannaMinich.com.
Yeah.
DeannaMinich.com. Also the same thing on Instagram. And I want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been enlightening to say the least. I, for one, will be listening to this over and over again. I'll be sharing with my beloved. She is very, very excited about cycles and seasons and hormones and all the things that we've discussed. And we can't wait to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much. What an honor. And thank you for doing what you're doing. And I may prod a little bit in the future to see how you're going with this certification program, because I think this is, just something that may just change the course of how we understand health. So thank you for doing what you're doing. It's really been a privilege speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, Espen. Thank you for your very insightful questions. And thank you for being open and expansive and allowing to just whatever is meant to come forth, come out. So I really like your energy and the space that you're holding for the podcast. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Deanna Minich, everybody.